Hi, we really enjoyed your presentation. Of course, we are familiar with your work and we love it. So the first question we want to ask you is connected sort of with the program that is approached in this competition. We are experiencing a housing crisis, and the younger generations are finding harder and harder to afford a house in the city or near the city, while continually working here where the jobs are. So what solutions do you think we as architects can propose for this? And what have you, like through the development of your projects, what have you come up with in terms of dealing with this pressing problem?
I think it starts politically, not necessarily at architects, because we think we can change the world and really do everything, but in reality we're bound to certain things. I think politically it's really important that things are better distributed, that there's more like a policy and a long-term vision rather than the short incidence policies that there are now. And only then, like we architects come in, right, Gijs?
Yeah. Well, it's been a question that has been on our mind since we have been visiting Iasi. That is the lack, actually, of an urban vision on a grander scale for the city. If you talk about this particular city and what should be done here, if you're talking about the housing crisis, without a vision that is bigger than just a plot, maybe, right, or maybe even just a quarter of a district. It needs to be city encompassing, right? We need to start to put a marker somewhere in the future about where Iasi wants to go. We take the data, like we always do, of how many people will be coming to Iasi, and we need to try and facilitate that for them, right? So we need to start to visualize that. I'd put a massive tower here, right in front of the palace, as high as it needs to be, to facilitate the 10,000 people, 50,000 people that will be coming to Iasi, just to provoke, just to say, look, this is our challenge, this is what we have to solve. Right? You see this is a massive challenge, let's start to work towards it, and then we can start to visualize proposals. And those proposals can be multitude, right? They can be new areas that can be developed with a certain density and a sort of compactness. It can be old areas that can have infusions, tiny bits of apartments, of architecture added to it. It can be buildings that we reinvent, right? Office buildings that are not working anymore. Let's gut them and put apartments in there, right? So these structures that we have here, these massive concrete structures, they are massively, I don't know, over-dimensioned, right? Let's put something on top. Let's have 2, 3, 4 layers of light, wood, apartment buildings right on top of that as a floating cloud. There's endless possibilities, but if we don't have the vision, and if we don't start to visualize it, it will remain not within our grasp, right? It's impossible to work on it. So that would be our advice, to start there, and start to think big, to visualize it.
And have you walked a little bit around the city, excluding the city center? And what do you think is like, okay, we have the city center, that's the major thing, but what is important is also the relation of the city center with its borders and the vicinity that this creates, and maybe like poles of interest that are outside of the center, and how can the center unite the periphery, and what do you think is the relationship that could be established between these two, and how can architecture can mediate this dialogue between the center and its periphery?
Well, it starts with the broader vision. It starts with what is the brief, no? What is needed, because if you go from incident to incident, then you solve something on a plot that 2 years later was not the right question to solve. We solve many questions that are not the right questions, and that is something that is super intriguing. And if you ask then people like, but what is the bigger picture, then they don't know. But how do you solve things if you don't know what is the right question? And that is what Gijs is trying to say. Like, if you know what is the question, then you can say, like, listen, this is the enormous amount. We need a 500-meter tower here, no? And nobody wants that, of course. But if that is only for 1 year of need for apartments, for example, at least you have a start of a dialogue, and then you can start to move and shift and think, like, what do we want? Now, do we endlessly want to spread out the city? No, do we simply continue with super low density over the hills, on top of the hills? Or do we say like, no, listen, this is the city, this is the boundary of where we stay, and within that we go to densify.
Exactly.
I know you have experiments with the towers and how towers can actually feel low density. So,
More open.
Yeah, more open.
More livable, more human.
Yeah, more human. And in this respect, do you see for Yash maybe like in the future more of a skyline that can develop in this direction?
It's definitely not an impossibility. Right now, I think that the city is not ready for it yet, but that takes time, right? That vision needs to be made so that it can slowly start to become part of people's mindset that it might happen in the future. And if you then do it, you got to do it properly. You got to do it in a way that Yash would support a higher density development. So maybe there's not towers in yet. Maybe it starts with a much more densified plot that is opened up. There's another hill added to the cityscape of Yash, but an inhabitable hill. Maybe that's something that is more applicable to the site here. Densification, but also the layering of functions, right? Let's not separate it. Let's make sure that the offices get a place there, that the housing gets a place on top, that the park is put on top of that. Why not? Why not? We can do this. We have shown that we can do it all together. The technology is there, but more importantly, the need is there. The limit of land that we have and that we can use, it's growing smaller by the minute, right? So let's make optimal use of what we have and do it properly and nicely mixed, and with a clear view that we need to make this planet into something that we would want to live in and can still live in a couple of years in the future.
Another follow-up question about that. How do you, everything we build needs to be for the future also, because the building doesn't have only our lifespan, but the next generation lifespan. So how do you account for that? How do you account for change in society and maybe behavioral patterns and views, and how do you also build for this generation but also for the next? How do you make peace, mediate these two in your projects?
It's a very dangerous topic actually, because everybody thinks about flexibility and now today it needs to be this and tomorrow it needs to change to something else. And with that, the result of those projects is a very anonymous project without character, and then it will be taken down because nobody likes the building. So it didn't change over time because it didn't live long enough to do that. So we try to solve the answer in such a way that the building has character, that the building stays and stays longer, and within that we try to be flexible and adaptable. But not the other way around. You don't start from something super generic that could be anything, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. What is it? The most sustainable building is a building that is loved. Right? If you want to live somewhere and you want to take care of a building, then it will survive much longer than a building that you would move into and think, okay, so this is my apartment. That apartment is exactly the same. That apartment is exactly the same. I have no identity here, right? So why would you take root there? Make it something that people can relate to, that they're proud of, and that building will survive much longer. And if we build it according to good standards now, then there is there's a reason for it, and there's how do you say it? It is allowed to stay longer, right? Because it's done properly, and then it becomes a cherished building.
Thank you. That was a great answer, by the way. The last question is related to your process of design. What are the first steps? What do you go through in generating that first spark of an idea? And as an individual and as an office also. I think that's also interesting.
You want to give this a go?
No, you can.
No, it's something that we spoke about just now in the presentation as well. It is far from a linear process. It is always something that we start anew with, and maybe along the same steps a little bit, but the outcome, we never know it beforehand. So it starts with a lot of gathering of opinions, of ideas, of general thoughts of what could happen somewhere on the one hand, but maybe on the other hand, more importantly, sometimes for us is the data. Right? What is there? What is the surrounding? How is the sun angle actually? Right? What is the program that needs to be on? What's the density? What's the possibility of stacking programs, for instance? And once we have that kind of gathered, and we start to more or less take the guidelines that we have as an office. That means making it a sustainable, future-proof development, making it a social development, making it a activated and collective development, making it maybe in some ways flexible. We take all those incentives or those ambitions that we have, and we start to see if we can take one and radicalize the building on that account, right? So okay, now it's radically open. So cut a million holes in it. Like, oh, okay, that looks like this. So option 1. Then we make it radically green, right? We take the whole building and we kind of dip it in a bit of green and we put it back and like, okay, now it's almost a covered forest. Oh wait, but if we make a covered forest and we make it porous, then we get a spin-off. And this way, by radicalizing always a certain approach, we start to detect which things work well, which things are able to be achieved in this particular spot. Because the difficulty, like you say, also for the housing crisis, it's not the only crisis at the moment, right? And there's a sustainability crisis going on that we need to somehow face, right? There's this crisis of building materials not being available. There's the energy crisis. All of these things, they are fighting for attention, and it's very, very difficult to solve them all in one building. But if you solve one very well, and you can make an exemplary building of it, maybe somebody else can take it, take the idea, take the innovative features that you developed, and apply it in a different building again. And it gets a second life in that sense.
Snowball effect.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. We need to learn from each other, right? We made a book, it's called Copy Paste, and we mean that very literally. Take our building, do it again somewhere, but do it again, but then with something slightly better, always. And then fine, right? Why not rebuild it? If something works, do it again, but do it again slightly better. Try to improve, always.
One of the bases of creativity.
Exactly, right? Stay curious.
Yeah.
All right.